If you go to church on Sunday, you are participating in a ritual experience intended to put you in a position where you are receptive to God's grace. And can you be receptive to God's grace without participating in an organized religion? Yes, I think you can, but it's a lot harder.
You mentioned the demonic, and that's very real, and I think that that's part of the misunderstanding when people say, well, I'm not religious like you, but I'm spiritual. They somehow assume that whatever's going on spiritually is good.
Right.
And I think those of us who are Christians would want to say, listen, it's not.
Souls can get lost, and you can see this just in everyday life. You without even getting into like possession and exorcism, you can see people who just seem to get lost. The value of religion itself is having some kind of authority and guidance, spiritual direction and so on, for someone to say, this path you've taken that you thought was godly maybe has taken a detour into the wrong place.
Welcome to Socrates in the Studio, which falls under the aegis, and I believe also the rubric, but we're going to check, of Socrates in the City. Socrates in the City usually happens in Manhattan, where I live, and today it's happening in Manhattan. We're here up on 95th Street on the east side, and it's my privilege today to someone whom I've known a long time. You may know him as a columnist for the New York Times. He's the author of many books. His name is Ross Douthat. Ross, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to see you.
The most wonderful thing is I'm able to pronounce your name. I think most people would be challenged.
You've been trained in it since I was 12 years
Literally,
old, and you were 15.
I was
because we're basically the same age.
We have to start there, but just to say that yes, I knew you when you were 12. I knew your mom, and there's something purely delightful to watch someone grow up, even if they don't flourish as you have flourished. Just a joy to see you, generally speaking, but a joy to see what you've been doing and thinking and writing. Today, of course, we're talking about your brand new book, and the title of the book seems to me, at least for you, to be uncharacteristically provocative. Maybe it's not, but the title...
Aggressive.
Okay.
It's aggressive.
The title of the book is Believe, You Idiot. No, the title of the book is simply Believe, but the subtitle is Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And knowing you as I do, that does seem, I said it's aggressive, and I don't really mean that in a pejorative sense, but it's interesting, and whenever one titles a book, as I have so many times, one should be thoughtful about it. What is the posture of the title? What are you suggesting? What do you mean to suggest? So that's really the first thing I wanted to ask you, because it is somewhat provocative. Believe,
yeah.
You understood, and then the subtitle, Why Everyone Should Be Religious.
Yeah, it's trying to be, if not aggressive, at least a little bit insistent, maybe. And it's a book that tries to speak, I think, to some of the distinctive aspects of our religious moment right now in 2025, when I think we've passed through an era of secularization and declining church attendance in America, really going back for the last 15 or 20 years. And now we're in a period not of religious revival, but of kind of reconsideration, where I think a lot of people, a lot of non-religious people, are looking around at the culture and the country we've made as we've become more secular. They're dissatisfied with it. They recognize that when, for instance, the famous New Atheists promised that if America became less religious, it would be more reasonable, less polarized, less divided, all these things, they were just wrong, right? People, it turns out, can divide themselves up pretty easily without any kind of religious justification. And also there's a lot of, I think, genuine sort of personal anxiety about the universe, especially among younger people today, that there wasn't to the same degree a while back. So you have this reconsideration, but then you have a lot of people coming to religion who have, some of them come to it with no religious background whatsoever. Like, we're not talking about lapsed Catholics or Christmas and Easter Methodists. We're talking about people who don't know who Cain and Abel are, right? Who don't sort of, haven't read the Bible, don't really know anything about theological categories, let alone Christianity. So in a way, the book is trying to be sort of an introduction to people in that position, people who say, I might be interested in religion, but I don't know anything about it. Tell me why I should take it seriously. But then it also tries to go beyond that introduction and to also say, you should take religion seriously, and by the way, it's almost certainly true and it should change your life. And there's a tiny bit of, maybe not lapel shaking, but at least maybe lapel pinching going on, because I think there's a lot of people who get comfortable with the idea that they're interested in religion and they admire and respect some religious thinkers and they wish they could believe, but isn't it just too hard for a serious, rational, modern person to become religious, right? And I'm trying to say, come on, no, it's not, right? In fact, there are a lot of pretty good arguments for why there probably is a God. The universe probably was designed and ordered with human beings in mind. That God is probably interested in who we are and what we do. And those arguments aren't, I don't expect to convince people 100%, but I would like people to seriously engage with those arguments and not just treat religion as this sort of nice, interesting thing, but that doesn't impose any kind of urgent demands on you.
What you just said now about, there are, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you just said something like there are probably some or pretty good arguments, that God exists and that he designed the universe and designed us for this universe. And so, and it's interesting because this is where I get back to the idea of tone. You say that pretty gently. I used to be more in that camp, but in the last years I have become more aggressive in saying it because I think it's sort of like if you're discussing whether the earth is flat. There comes a point where it's difficult to have a serious conversation because you know that it's not flat. And so you try to respect the person who's coming from that point of view, but at the same time you feel like saying, listen, it's not just that there's evidence, but it's so overwhelming. Like, take a look. Believe me, I'm not,
Right.
And so there's some of that in the book. You talk about, I want to talk about everything in the book, but the simple idea, believe why everyone should be religious. Why do you say religious? I'm probably a little more sensitive than most to that term because my most recent book is called Religionless Christianity, which is a Bonhoeffer phrase, but he's using religion in the pejorative sense of Karl Barth, that you can have mere religion as opposed to actual faith, that you can have the trappings of religion, and that can be something that is not valuable or even dramatically negative. So why did you, rather than say everyone should have faith, why did you say why everyone should be religious?
Well, I think you have to, read the signs of the times, right, a little bit. And so about 15 years ago, I wrote a book that was called Bad Religion, that started with a quote from Barth, actually, as its epigraph, right? Because at that point, I thought that America was still more religious then than it is today, and I was critiquing forms of religion on some of the grounds that you described, and saying that they're heretical, they don't necessarily lead people to God, they sort of comfort, they comfort the comfortable, right, rather than afflicting the comfortable. And that critique of religion is always there, and it always has a certain kind of power. It's there in the New Testament, right? Jesus has very harsh things to say about the religious authorities of his day. But there is also a way in which, for most people in most times and places, religion is the solid foundation for the true relationship with God, right? And it's not that religion gets you all the way to that relationship necessarily. And I'm not saying in this argument that I'm going to reason you into a relationship with God. No, that's about, what you do and what God does, right? It's about divine grace. It's about love. It's a relational thing. But I do think I'm trying to reason people into thinking they should have a relationship with God. And that is what religion is for, as a kind of, to be crude about it, as a kind of social technology. Right? If you go to church on Sunday, you are participating in a ritual experience intended to put you in a position where you are receptive to God's grace. And can you be receptive to God's grace without participating in an organized religion? Yes, I think you can, but it's a lot harder, right? And I say in the book, one thing the book talks a bit about is the very commonplace idea in American culture, among non-Christians certainly, that you can be spiritual and not religious, or you can just sort of pick something from lots of different religions and make your own personalized religion and get closer to God that way. And I'm not going to say that that's impossible. God works through all kinds of people and ways of being and so on. But what I say in the book is, look, you, meaning you and me and everyone else, are probably not a religious genius, right? Like the odds are that you are not uniquely situated to like pluck a little bit of Hinduism, a little Buddhism, a little Christianity and figure it out. It is much more likely that you, like most people, are going to be better off participating, submitting, joining a tradition larger than yourself, and that is the good side of religion, which again leaves plenty of room for the bad side. And if we get a big religious comeback in America and we have powerful religious institutions again, then I can write a new book saying, okay, here's where those institutions are going wrong. But I think at this moment, in 2025, a little more religion would be good for our country and our culture.
Okay, so then I was intuiting that, but it's good to hear you say it, that you're trying to look at where we are now and what needs to be said, particularly now.
Yes.
And so we're living in a culture that is irreligious or secular, or it's interesting because, since you're a columnist for the Times, I feel, having lived in Manhattan most of my life, there's a smug secularity. In other words, there's an idea that no one does religion anymore. And that, of course, has become pretty entrenched. And so it is the more shocking for you to say, no, we should look at this seriously. And so I'm getting the idea that that's your intent.
And I think it's not, I don't think it's a smug moment right now. I think that smugness is there, certainly, and
it's
been there for it's still there. Look, America is a big, complicated country, and if you want to find a smug secular atheist, you can find one. Go on the internet, go into the comment threads. You can find that person. But in terms of like what is the dominant mode in our culture right now, I don't think it's Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens declaring that religion is rubbish and poisons everything. I think it's much more people saying, I'm not religious, I struggle to see how you could believe in God. I'm talking about like more elite culture now, like Manhattan, right? Not the country as a whole, but the culture of the mass media and academia. I think there's a lot of people saying, I'm interested in religion, I don't really think I can fully believe in it, but I think it might be good for society. I talk to a lot of people who will say, I have a lot of friends who are, going back to church or going to their synagogue, and they don't really believe, but they feel like they missed religion and they want it back, right? So I think that's more where a lot of people are in 2025. And again, especially younger people, right? Like the cohort that was most influenced by a smug atheism is people my age, like late Generation X and early millennials, people who were there when the internet first hit, and suddenly it was like, you were getting exposed to, critiques of religion that no youth pastor was equipped to deal with, right? Like that was that reality. This is a different reality right now. Gen Z just, again, they haven't had as much experience with the bad side of religion that you described, so they're more open to the good side. I just think it's more unsettled and more open than it was, even when I started at the Times. I've been there, 15 years now.
It is interesting to think generationally because I grew up in the 70s because I'm older than you, but you remember it was in the culture, people who were older than I, would be talking about their terrible experiences in the 50s and the 60s growing up in Catholic school and the nuns, and there was this kind of reaction to a culture that had been monolithically religious, where pretty much everyone went to church someplace. And so there was a reaction to that. And of course, the 60s and the 70s were the sexual revolution, to some extent, a reaction to that world, which had existed for the longest period of time. But as you say, we're really in a new day, and I think the older you get, the more you forget that, oh, everybody doesn't think the way I do. They've had,
Right.
recent decades have created different kinds of people.
This is probably the last point at which I will be able to say anything with authority about the younger generation, right? And in 15 or 20 years, I'll just be sort of sputtering and confused. But yes, I think you can see that right now. And it's different. I mean, there are places where I think it's clearer than in America. I think if you look at Western Europe right now, at places where secularization went the furthest, right? Like France and England, right, are much more secular than America ever became. And those are the places that have had actually the clearest rebound, not just a kind of plateau, but an actual rebound, seemingly, of religious commitment and belief. There's data out of the United Kingdom, for instance, that shows that genuinely Generation Z is more religious than Generation X in the UK, which is, I mean, and again, you're starting from a low threshold, right?
Right.
But there's similar data in France. Adult baptisms and conversions are going up. So I do think, first of all, as Christians, we think God is always there, right? And you're never going to achieve total secularization. Right, but what that means is you get pendulum swings.
Yeah.
You get eras where people get tired of sort of the potentially oppressive side of organized religion and experience secularization as a relief. And then you have eras like ours where people look around at a secular landscape and say, well, what is the purpose of life again? Where are we going as human beings? And suddenly religion becomes relevant again.
Part of how I have diagnosed this, I guess, in my lifetime is that I don't know if it was I think it was Peter Berger who said that, we're a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. In other words, that America largely is very religious, but that the elites are dramatically secular. And I think that has held for, a very long time. And so I think of, obviously, publications like The Times. They assume secularity. They seem to live in a world where there is no other option. And so I feel that most Americans taking in whatever media they're taking in, they don't hear about, I just think of my own experience. When I was 25, I had this dramatic conversion experience, and suddenly I'm inundated with amazing books and speakers, and I thought, where have they existed? I grew up in a world where none of this existed. And I feel that that's part of it. I think that if you're looking for clues in the culture, the elites in the culture tend to be so secular that you would get the impression that nobody's having any religious experiences. And I'm thinking in your book you reference your mother, whom I know, having in the 80s a very dramatic, I don't know what you call it, mystical experience, I guess we would say with the Holy Spirit, but it's so dramatic, it seems impossible to think that she's making it up or whatever. If you've been around that, it's just impossible to dismiss it. I mean, you can make of it what you will, but it's impossible to say that stuff doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, and this is part of why, I mean, I have not had really intense religious and mystical experiences in my own life. I've had some, experiences that sort of are on the edges of that category, but nothing that would fit naturally into like William James's varieties of religious experience or something. But I have been around people, including my mother, but other people as well, who have had those experiences. I have watched people have those experiences. And that is in part why the book spends a certain amount of time talking about religious experience as important evidence, important reason to take religion seriously. So it's not just about the fine-tuning of the physical laws of the cosmos. It's not just about the mystery of consciousness. It's also just the persistent reality that it sure seems like some kind of higher power is knocking on people's doors. And that, to your point about elites, in the book I use the term official knowledge. Right? It's not that the 21st century or the 20th century were actually disenchanted. People use that term a lot, right? That implies that like religious experiences stopped happening. And they did not, right? By some measures, you get Pentecostalism is an entirely 20th century phenomenon. Near-death experiences only become culturally important when we start bringing lots of people back from the brink of death, right? So there's all these ways in which the mystical is still there or reemerges, but you do have this layer of like, if you are at Yale Law School, if you are, in academia, if you are editing a Wikipedia entry, right, you're going to have a strong anti-supernaturalist bias. I don't know if that will last forever, though. I think the Berger line totally applies to America in 1975. In 2025, a couple of things have changed. One is that working class America has become less religious. People are still pretty likely to say they believe in God, but like church going has fallen way off in blue collar, Rust Belt America, right? And then there's actually more church going among college educated Americans. And there's a lot of places where religion is kind of an indicator of, having things together, like people who sort of have it together and have kids and so on are going to church. And I think that may change the dynamic he describes. I also think that just the world is getting weirder generally in an important way. Like maybe, there's some 1970s elements about it, like people are interested in UFOs again. All of this stuff with AI has weird, slightly supernaturalist overtones. And I just think younger elites, like whoever they are, but like, Harvard, Yale, whatever group you want, I think they're going to have maybe not a Christian view on the world, probably not necessarily, but certainly a weirder and more open-minded view of what's happening in reality than people did 30 years ago.
So the strict materialism of the past, you think is waning?
I mean, look, everybody's biased by who they talk to, right? So anyone who has me on their podcast to talk about this book probably is maybe more open-minded than average about religion. But what I have found in talking with people who are journalists, intellectuals who are non-believers is I get very few people making the really hard materialist pitch and saying, come on, Ross, we know the universe is just whirling atoms and it's all an accident. I get a lot more people who are willing to say, hey, I think you're probably right. There is something more complex and weirder going on. Maybe there is some kind of higher purpose. I'm not going to call it God. I can't get there on like literal miracles, like healing miracles. No, I can't get there. Yeah. But I think a lot of even elites are, they're willing to say that kind of the reductive materialist portrait of reality is missing something big, which I think it obviously is.
There are two kinds of evidence, I would say. One is this visceral experiences with God that you just said have not waned, even though the culture pretends that religion is ebbing and we're more sophisticated. Nonetheless, you keep hearing stories. I wrote a book on miracles, 10 or so years ago, and I would ask people, have you ever experienced a miracle? And they would kind of like look around.
Yep.
And then they would tell me this insane miracle story that was obviously a miracle. It's not like sort of, like amazing, but they were given the message, we don't talk about that, and I thought, why? It's so amazing. Yep. And so there is, it's why I wrote a book about it. I said, people need to know how normative this is, how many kinds of miraculous experiences are, and then you say, I'm not telling you what to think, but what do you make of it? Are these people lying? Are they crazy? And I think a fair-minded person would say, no, there seems to be something here. So there's that, and I've experienced tons of that. You've been around it your whole life. The other evidence that you cite earlier in the book, which I've also written about, is like the fine-tuned universe. The evidence that all of this couldn't just be here, that there at least science can now show us what it maybe couldn't have 50 or 80 years ago, that the level of design is so overwhelming that it's heart-stopping, at least for me.
Yeah, it's a matter of probabilities. A universe like this, capable of having stars and planets and complex life and us, is just staggeringly improbable, out of the range of possible universes. And there was a period when the scientific assumption was that there was going to be they were going to figure out something that made the universe necessary, right? Where it was like, oh, it had to be this way.
Right.
But right now, all of the evidence suggests it didn't have to be this way. You could have an infinite number of possible other universes, and almost all of them would be dead and lifeless or collapsing in on themselves, and somehow we ended up with this one. And this has thrown the materialists into a very weird position, where the refuge of the materialist from that argument is to posit that all of those other universes actually exist, right? This is the multiverse
that is breathtaking.
hypothesis, and it is a breathtaking claim. Now, something can be breathtaking and true, right? But the nature of that claim is not a scientific claim in the way we understood what Copernicus or even Darwin was doing when they challenged religious ideas.
Right.
Nobody's saying, oh, there's a multiverse out there, and here's a telescope, you can look at it. Or there's a multiverse out there, here, we can dissect it and predict how it evolves. No, they're saying, well, in order to avoid one invisible designer, in order to avoid the idea, the simplest way to put it is that there's a lot of reason to think that mind precedes matter. You don't even have to call it God at first. You can just say mind, meaning intentionality and consciousness, seems to be constitutive of the universe, not reducible to the material, and seems to play some crucial role in bringing the universe into being. And to sort of wipe away that evidence and insist, no, matter has to come first, you are left with a wild metaphysical speculation about an infinity of non-available universes, right? Well, and at the very least, I don't think the choice there necessarily favors the atheist, right?
Well,
if that's
again,
the choice.
you're being so kind and a little coy, because it's really I said breathtaking. I could have said preposterous or insulting. It's ridiculous, frankly. In other words, it's somebody who simply doesn't like the idea that the facts might lead to X. They can't accept X, and they think, what can I possibly come up with that might get me to avoid X? I mean, it seems
right. I think
clear.
I think people often reject that evidence because they have some other objection to the idea of God, right? So if you dig into some of the hardcore atheist scientist writers, both biologists and physicists, often they will sort of say, well, actually, the real reason I think there couldn't be a God is some version of the problem of evil, right? It's like there's so much suffering in the world, I can't believe in a good God who created it. Mm-hmm. And to my mind, the problem of evil is, in fact, a difficult problem,
yeah.
But it's a problem that can be wrestled with in a context where you still think there's probably a God. And this is, in fact, what the Bible is full of. It's not like, when Abraham is, lawyering with God about whether to destroy Sodom, or when Job is complaining against God, or even when Jesus is in Gethsemane. There's no sense in the Bible that, the problem of evil is just easy and you can dismiss it. No, there's some real issue there, but it's not an issue that should lead you to atheism if all of the evidence that we've just been talking about suggests there's probably a God. It should lead you to be, you can have doubts, you can be uncertain. Yeah. What is God up to? Right. That's a good question, right? But it's a question that can be wrestled with inside a religious framework rather than rejecting the framework altogether.
Right. You refer in the book, you call it the Emeth principle. I have very, very often thought about the concept. I never heard of the term the Emeth principle, but
that's because I made it up.
Well, you made it up.
Yeah.
But you didn't make up Emeth.
Yes.
Of course, C.S. Lewis did make up the name Emeth, but he probably got it from some old Turkish dictionary.
He may exist in the multiverse. In the multiverse, there is a universe where Emeth exists.
But talk a little bit about the Emeth principle, because I really have thought of it very, very much over the decades, the concept of it. Educate my audience on what you mean.
So Emeth is a character in The Last Battle, the last of the C.S. Lewis books, and he's a Calorman, means he's a citizen of the empire that is opposed to Narnia.
Now, for some reason, I thought he was in The Horse and His Boy.
No, that book is also set in and around Calorman.
It's the Calorman
world.
Emeth
is the Calorman in The Last Battle. And in The Last Battle, the world ends, and people, there's the division of the sheep and the goats, and some people go to heaven with Aslan, and some people go somewhere else. And Emeth ends up in heaven in spite of the fact that the religion of Calormen worships Tash, a vulture demon who is obviously a stand-in for, if not the devil, at least like Moloch or some, some
Well,
sort of Sumerian.
Just to be clear, I mean, first of all, I didn't read the Narnia Chronicles till I was 30, I think, and they are so extraordinary. They're so helpful in thinking about God. I would say to any adult, if you want to read some great books that can help you think about God, that aren't, overly theological, I recommend the Narnia Chronicles. They're amazing. But the concept that Lewis comes up with, there's this group, the Calormens, who seem to be Arabs or Muslims, basically. I mean, that's kind of the culture that he's writing about. They're Arabic,
culture.
Right?
Yep.
And so the case that Lewis is making is that Emeth, even though he belongs to this tribe or this group, in his heart, he was worshiping the one true God. Right. So on some level, he was part of a world that is officially not worshiping the one true God, but that somehow in his heart he was.
Right. The idea is that he is sincerely seeking the truth and the true God, and he's in a cultural context where, again, in the Narnian context, the true God is Aslan, the great lion, right?
Right.
But that vision of God is not available to him. But nonetheless, through sincerity and goodwill, he is directing his religious intentions in the correct direction, and he is saved by that direction. Now, this is obviously, to some degree, we can just call it a kind of liberal concept in the sense that it is posited as a mechanism through which, from a Christian perspective, it's not just that Catholics can think Protestants are saved and vice versa, but you can think that sincere religious believers in non-Christian traditions are saved as well.
It's a bold thing for Lewis to assert.
Yes.
But I would say that it's biblical. I mean, but I know that if you brought it up to the wrong kind of people, to people who are particularly theologically focused, they would say, no. If you're part of that group, it doesn't matter.
Well, and I should say, this is, in the book, the book ends with a particular case for Christianity, where I talk about why I am a Christian and why I think the New Testament and the revelation of Jesus make sense of the larger realm of religious data. But the book is also trying to be helpful to people who aren't Christians or aren't Christians yet, whose religious journey might take them in other directions. And I do take it as an assumption that God is fully present in Christianity, but the presence of God is there in other religious traditions. I think it is very hard to make sense of the kind of supernatural, miraculous data that we were just talking about. And if you don't notice that, people have religious experiences outside Christianity that look a great deal like religious experiences inside Christianity. And I think you either, if you take the really hard line that says, there's literally no salvation outside the formal practice of Christianity, the decision for Christ if you're a Protestant, communion with the Catholic Church if you're a Catholic, then you have to say that all of that apparent divine activity outside Christianity is some kind of demonic deception, right? And there are people who will make that argument, but I am taking the view that there is a truest faith, and you should be seeking the truest faith, but that people of goodwill seeking God in a big, complicated world where everyone has a specific cross to bear can find enough of the truth to orient themselves toward God, even if they don't get all the way to the truest faith.
I mean, it's a very generous way to look at things, but I think it's correct. But I just can think of the people who are, as I said, very theologically focused who would bristle at that.
It's not a stern Calvinist view, right? But also there are people. Again, I'm Catholic. There are traditionalist Catholics who would be quite skeptical of the view, and it's a long-running argument inside Christianity. I think it's a really relevant argument right now, though, because again, we're in a landscape where the diversity of religious options and religious choices and the diversity of life paths, right, just makes it's hard to see how, you're going to get everyone in this particular cultural environment to sort of be drawn in one specific religious direction. If you're in a world where, as many people were for most of human history, most of Christian history, let's say, where there were only a couple choices. The choices were Christianity or paganism, or Catholicism or Protestantism, or Christianity or atheism. Then maybe you say, okay, well, look, people are being presented with this decisive choice, and God is going to judge them, for making the wrong choice. I think a merciful God, I don't know, you and I both know people. I mean, if you are interested in religion and you step out into the internet, there are 155 options available to you tomorrow. And I struggle to believe in a God who, looking at people proceeding with goodwill in that environment, does not provide a lot of different paths to him.
It's interesting, since we're talking about Lewis, I think of something that you mentioned. You don't, I think, reference Lewis, but Lewis wrote about this. The way, let's say, Christians think of classical antiquity, classical paganism, there are two ways to look at that. And I know that you reference this in the book, that those who worshipped the Greek gods, someone could say, yes, they're real, they were worshiping demons. Someone else could say, well, no, they weren't worshiping demons, they were worshiping I don't know what. But that's something that I think a lot of people are more comfortable with a more black and white view, that it's either the demonic or none of it matters. Who can
it's
say?
All just they were just there was nothing genuine in Greek religion, right? They were just worshiping nice mythic figments of their own imagination. And I think Lewis would say, and lots of Christians would say, that, well, Greco-Roman paganism seems to include within it a lot of intimations and indications and preliminaries and preparations for Christianity. So even the early Christians, on the one hand, they were often inclined, to emphasize sort of some of the demonic aspects of paganism. But they were also quick to argue that actually God had been preparing the ground for the revelation of Jesus. And that implies, in turn, that, again, some kind of connection to the true God was probably possible in ancient Athens or ancient Rome. When, before, if you live in ancient Rome before, a certain period, you're not going to have substantial contact with Judaism. This is before Christianity. Is your religion simply an expression of sort of, Satan's control over human beings? I don't think so. I think that the things that were sort of carried forward from paganism into Christianity, and things were carried forward, are themselves evidence that even in realms outside of the Christian revelation, God didn't just abandon people to a life where there was no possibility of contact with actual higher powers, not just lower powers.
Well, I want to get to the lower powers, but just to say that, for example, I think we would say we don't expect Socrates to be in hell. He seemed to be genuinely searching for truth, that you see something. I mean, if you look at his life and his work, that there was a respect for the truth and for virtue, and you can't help admire it, and you can't help, at least I would say I couldn't help, but somehow think he was on the right path. But again, there are people who would say, well, no, unless you're baptized, unless you've made a distinct profession of faith in Jesus.
Well, here at Socrates in the City, we take a pro-Socrates
we take a pro-Socrates
position.
view,
But you don't even, to bring it to the 21st century, right? You can have a conversation about religion in India, right? Because Hinduism is, in a way, a much transformed vision of what Europe might have looked like absent Christianity. You have paganism and polytheism. But you have lots of different schools and arguments going on, and you have within Hinduism people who are classical theists ultimately, who will say, the Hindu pantheon is an expression of sort of local expressions of divinity, but there's obviously a higher divinity outside time and space who made the world and so on. So just just there in contemporary Hinduism, you can see all of the different ways that a non-Christian society might think about God. And it really is quite complex, and there's a lot of complicated arguments there. And again, similarly, I'm not going to look at that landscape and say, this person who's a practicing Hindu who seems to have a very philosophically similar idea of who God ultimately is to a Christian is, inherently lost. You and I both know people who have not had in their life what feels like a strong impetus towards Christian belief. Maybe they've had a terrible experience with Christian belief. Plenty of people do, right? Does God not show mercy to people on that path? Does he not give them any path to him? Again, I am skeptical. One of the things I say in the book that, again, not everyone would agree with, right? But I think if you start out with these arguments we've been talking about for design and purpose in the cosmos, for religious experience, for a God who wants to get in touch with you, you should assume that God is not trying to trick you. He's not out to get you, right? Like the one true faith is not, buried in a cave somewhere and you're never going to get there and man, just too bad, God got you. No, that's not the God that I believe in, and I don't think it's a reasonable God to believe in the end.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, but I'm fascinated by how many people seem content with that kind of God, that unless you do this and this and this, or pray this and this and this, sorry, you're going to hell for eternity.
Well, people,
that's it.
Well, but I mean, people, I think, are worried reasonably about losing urgency.
Right.
Right? I mean, the New Testament is a very urgent book.
Right.
Right? And the early Christians are very urgent people. And it's true, you don't want to slip into a world where you're saying, I'm religious and you're religious and we're all fine and nobody needs to convert to anything.
Right.
Because, everybody, everything will work out. I mean, I do think everything will work out. But it's very clear if you're a Christian that, God, Jesus, St. Paul, they're asking you urgently to do something. And to the extent that I can strike the balance in the book between saying that I think God isn't trying to trick you and saying that we should be urgent is by saying God wants you to do something. God wants you to change your life. Maybe that change isn't going to carry you all the way to what I think is the fullest expression of Christianity. But the person you don't want to be is the servant who's given the talent and buries it in the field. That, in my reading of the New Testament, that is the person who you absolutely don't want to be. You want to find somewhere to invest, and it's better to invest in the wrong thing than not to invest at all.
And it's interesting, you do talk in the book in a couple of places, you mentioned the demonic, and that's very real, and I think that's part of the misunderstanding when people say, well, I'm not religious like you, but I'm spiritual. They somehow assume that whatever's going on spiritually is good.
Right.
And I think those of us who are Christians would want to say, listen, it's not. There are demonic entities. And it's funny, too, because I mentioned miracles, but there are people that have had experiences with the demonic or whatever, and it scares them, and they kind of shrink from it in a way. And I suppose you'd want to say to them, yeah, it's real, but you can do more than simply shrink from it. I mean, you should be afraid of it to some extent. And
you want to be
maybe
careful.
that's...
You want to have a healthy respect for the possibilities of spiritual danger without getting too obsessed, right?
You want to be just obsessed enough.
No, I mean, I honestly, I thought about, so I write a bunch about spiritual experience in the book, and I thought about having a whole section on, possession, these kind of things. And I read some things about it, and I was like, you know what? I actually don't think I want to go there. I have some footnotes if people are interested. There are other books they can read. But I think it's enough to say these dangers are real, they're out there, and people experience them, again, outside a Christian context. Like if you read the literature of people doing like strong psychedelics to induce spiritual experiences, a lot of those experiences are very, very positive. Some of them are negative, right? And you'll find sort of people on psychedelic forums saying, I had an encounter with a negative entity. I don't know how to respond to it, right? And I think just being aware of that reality, that there are, if you don't want to use the term demons, you don't have to. You can say there are negative entities out there who don't have your best interests at heart. And again, to go back to where we started, one good reason to be religious and not just spiritual, not just out there on your own, is that all of the old religions, but Christianity especially, have always made it their special business to protect people in direct ways from negative entities. The rite of baptism in my own Catholic Church is very clear that, this isn't just to usher you to salvation, it is to protect you and free you from the most negative entity of all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, that's putting it nicely, negative entity. It's so horrifying when we're talking about the demonic, and anybody who's had any experience with it knows how unbelievably horrifying it is.
Yep.
And so if you read books about exorcism, and you mention that in your book, you understand there's a reality here. And what goes along with that, I guess we should say, is the idea of deception. In other words, it's one thing to say, okay, I want to pray this prayer so that demons don't attack me tonight. But more broadly,
never a bad idea.
No, but
in
more,
my view.
But more broadly, there is deception, and there are, in other words, I could see somebody reading your book and saying, well, yeah, I'm open to the spiritual, and I think you raise the caution in the book, but there are people who have been led astray into, I guess, what we would call false religions. The Bible says that, the devil appears as an angel of light. And there are a lot of people that would say, well, no, all religions are the same, and it doesn't really matter. That's kind of the flip side of, the Emeth principle, as you put it, that, theology matters.
Right, and there's a hard balance to strike, because you want to be able to both say, because I think it is true, that God is present in a lot of places and there are a lot of potential paths to God, but also that it does in fact matter what you believe and how you pray and how you practice, and souls can get lost. And, we don't even have to have the argument about eternity. Maybe they aren't lost for eternity. We don't have to get into that debate. We can just say, souls can get lost, and you can see this just in everyday life. You without even getting into like possession and exorcism, you can see people who just seem to get lost, and as you say, people who seem to get somewhat deceived by what they think is the path that God wants them to be on, that turns out not to be that path, and that's where the dark side of religion comes from. It's where some of the dark sides of politics in our own time come from. People are looking for, in a complicated world, what does God want, and can end up in the wrong place. And they need, again, the value of religion itself is having some kind of authority and guidance, spiritual direction, and so on, for someone to say, hey, this path you've taken that you thought was godly maybe has taken a detour into the wrong place.
In the few minutes we have left, I would love you to talk a little bit about your own journey growing up and where you found yourself since, because I really think people's stories are often the most compelling argument for why somebody might want to try something crazy like what you have tried.
I mean, so you've mentioned my mother, who you were friends with when I was a kid. I grew up in southern Connecticut. My parents were sort of lukewarm Episcopalians.
Is there any other kind?
Is there other? Well,
sorry.
Well, no, but as you know from that time, there was a kind of Pentecostalist, charismatic renewal inside the Episcopal Church,
Correct.
right? So you actually, you could go church shopping and try and find the Episcopal Church where people spoke in tongues.
Yeah, and I did.
But that was right. But that was some time ago. But yeah, we ended up, my mother had a friend, my mother had some chronic health problems, and she had a friend who attended faith healing services who said, you should come to a faith healing service. And they were held, strangely, in high school auditoriums around Connecticut, which always seemed to raise some church-state issues, public high schools. But I guess they just rented them out on weekends. And it was a woman named Grace. And, she...
Don't worry, the state took the money and did bad things with it.
That's right.
Don't worry about that.
I would have no doubt.
Yeah.
This is the Northeast. But a woman named Grace,
right.
A wonderful name, and she had, she played guitar, people played guitar and sang and all that kind of stuff, but she would go around and, point to people and say, you're struggling with this, and they'd come out into the aisle and she'd pray for them, and you've encountered this kind of thing. People would fall down and have intense experiences of the Holy Spirit. And my mother had more than one. Again, this was not unique to her. Like, this was a very normal thing. It was like the kind of thing where people would be lying on the floor, sort of having an intoxicating spiritual experience for 40 minutes, and someone would put a blanket over them to keep them warm, and they wouldn't even notice. And so that started when I was about 7 or 8, and so that meant my childhood had this kind of double quality where most of the time I went to a normal secular private high school and had sort of a normal Southern Connecticut, mostly politically liberal kind of life, and then on the weekends we went and I watched my parents speak in tongues. And that sort of shaped my whole professional career, where I, write a column for a nice.
It's turned you into the monster you are today.
The monster that I am today, where I have this kind of, I think I have a really strong sense of sort of what the broad secular worldview is and how it works, and then I also have this sense, going back to being a kid, that the world is stranger than that, and weirder things happen, and you need to take them seriously. And I guess the other experience that I've had that is sort of notable is, so we ended up becoming Roman Catholic at the end of my teenage years, and I was sort of a kind of conservative Catholic who wrote about politics from that perspective. When I was in my 30s, we moved from Washington D.C. back to Connecticut, and bought a farmhouse and tried to sort of live the rural life. And I immediately contracted Lyme disease, which is the great scourge of the Northeast. And I became incredibly sick, and I ended up in this terrain of chronic illness where the official medical consensus has nothing to offer you, nothing to say, and you basically are sort of on your own trying to figure things out. And that experience, I wrote a different book about that, was primarily a sort of a medical experience and not a spiritual experience, but it obviously had sort of spiritual components and elements. And it was also an experience that sort of brought home to me the persistent gap between reality as it's described by the formal establishment and reality as it actually exists as a human being having experiences in the world. And so those two, I think the childhood experience and the adult experience, both exerted a profound shaping influence on me. I think what I've tried to do with those experiences, though, is always have a certain kind of balance where you want to accept that the world is weirder and more complex, but you also don't want to be pulled all the way to the assumption that if the establishment says it, it's a lie, right? The establishment gets some things right. It's probably some things you and I disagree about where and how those lines are drawn, but I think it's important to maintain a sense that, there is an objectively weirder world out there than what's described by official knowledge, but you don't only want to live in the weird world. You want to recognize that official knowledge, we wouldn't have this entire civilization if official knowledge hadn't gotten some big things right. But that's, I don't know, that's some sort of life story that shaped my perspective.
It's important. It's what enabled you to write the book, and I'm glad you shared a little bit about that at the end of the book. The last part of the book, or the last line of the book, you really focus this exhortation in the title, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, at the end, because throughout the book you're kind of presenting this smorgasbord of ideas and options and things, but at the end you focus it down. The last line of the book, you're talking about somebody who's kind of sleepwalking, I guess. And the last line of the book is, if you are this sleeper, I beg of you, awake. That's a beautiful way to end the book, and I guess it's a good way to end our conversation. Very grateful to you, Ross, for your time and for the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here. every week. Thank you for tuning in.